You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Hello, and welcome to another installment of the Insights podcast series from the Human Capital Center here at the Conference Board. I'm Rebecca Ray, and I have the privilege of leading the U.S. Human Capital Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this podcast, Mental Health and the American Worker, What Workers Want. And I'm also delighted that Dr. Srini Pillay, co-founder and chief medical officer at Reulay and former head of the Outpatient Anxiety Disorders Program at Harvard Medical School's McLean Hospital, is joining me for this second of a series on mental health issues. Srini, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me, Rebecca.
Well, we last met and talked a little bit about the survey findings that we did about 2 months ago, and we saw that there was quite a strong feeling among the thousands of respondents that their level of mental health had declined since the beginning of the pandemic. And today we're here to talk about the results of a brand new survey that is just coming out of the field now, and excited to see and to share and talk a little bit about what these more than 1,200 U.S. workers thought, not only about mental health, but also about returning to the workplace and some of the implications for them in this time of the Great Resignation. So thank you for joining. And I'd like to start maybe with a couple of thoughts here. So we hear so much about this Great Resignation, right? And I'm wondering if it's so much about a Great Resignation, about maybe it's a great reset, about wanting the future to look different, no matter where you are in your professional life, and maybe the courage to go make those changes. What do you think? How do you see this time?
Well, I think there is undoubtedly a great resignation occurring. And I do think that resignation is about resetting. And I think part of what that resetting is about is the fact that the pandemic really did alter people's perceptions of their own lives. It altered assumptions that they had made about having to be at work every day. It altered assumptions about what they thought was acceptable versus not acceptable. And when there's change that occurs, it actually activates the conflict center in the brain, which is the anterior cingulate cortex. And as a result, we get what we call brain chaos, or the more formal term for that is cognitive dissonance. Now, a lot of people do not institute changes in their lives because change causes cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance is uncomfortable. So they would rather just go back to doing what they were doing. But with COVID, this dissonance was imposed on people. So in a sense, their brains were already prepared to change. And given that they had these background ideas of what's a better life for me, what assumptions might have changed, and given that they had these change-related brain changes had already occurred, I think it actually gave them the tailwinds that they needed to make the changes that they might have been thinking about all along.
I think there's something to that. And, as we talk to folks at the various organizations who are members of the conference board, and some of those executives will talk about the various reasons that are underpinning generational choices. But at the end of the day, it is about choice, I think. And, one of the findings in this particular survey, we asked people if they had changed jobs since the pandemic. And what we found was that when they did, they left for one of three reasons, the top three reasons. Better pay and career advancement have traditionally been two of the biggest drivers. That has not changed. But what surprised us a little bit was 1 in 4 said that the ability to work from anywhere was a real driver in their decision to take a new role. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the ability to work from anywhere really reflects the desire for making one's own choices and for living a more flexible life. And I think that people recognize that when they work from home, they might have been able to multitask more effectively. They probably had a greater sense of agency, and they probably also felt more motivated. When you think about motivation and what goes on in the brain when we are motivated, autonomy is one of the key factors that's involved in creating a motivated brain. And I think when people have this autonomy and this greater flexibility, they actually feel more jazzed up in the sense that the brain's dopamine systems are probably firing more. and then they're feeling more encouraged about being able to work. I think at a functional level, what I think makes sense is that every human being, even if they're all working for the same organization, has a different life. Some people have to attend to their children. Some people have to attend to, the elderly. Some people have to attend to multiple other things that they're doing at home. And so having this flexibility really makes the statement that there's no one size fits all, and that as long as you have your mind on the task and your mind on the goal, you can still complete that goal, but you can do it in your own way. And I think what this flexible work environment allowed people to see was that they didn't have to do things in a prescribed way. They could do it in a way that gave them greater autonomy, it motivated them more, it also allowed them to do things that they wanted to do on their own terms. And there's something to be said, I think, for having that degree of flexibility while keeping your eye on the goal.
I think there's something to that. I think a lot of stress comes directly from the things that you feel you have no control over. And so having more control over the way you work and from a particular location or flexibility, that was huge. And in fact, I don't mean to put people into generational boxes because to your point, everyone is different and different life experiences and whatnot. But it was interesting to me to see that baby boomers wanted this ability to work from anywhere at almost twice the rates of their younger colleagues. I'm not sure what to make of that, but there is a yearning for flexibility, I think, no matter where you are. But it surprised me that boomers were, that was at the top of the list for them.
It also surprised me because you hear so much about the millennials sort of wanting greater flexibility, and millennials wanting to do things in their own terms and being more vocal. So when I heard that baby boomers were at the top of that list, it did surprise me, but it really got me to think what's happening in that particular generation of people. And as you said, this is a generalization, but I imagine that there are several drivers of that. But when you look more deeply at the survey, it did seem that one of the reasons that the people who wanted to go back to work, at least part time, wanted to go back, had to do with social connection. And I think that when you're younger, this forming social circles and feeling socially connected might still be in development. And I wondered whether for the baby boomers, their social lives were already fairly settled. And so having this greater flexibility meant more to them than having to be in a social environment. That was one of the things that occurred to me. But it also occurred to me that in this group, between the mid 50s and the 70s, that there's also there are a lot of other things happening at that time. Things like existential crises, like what is the meaning of my life, and is my work life coming to an end, and how do I really want to live my life in a fulfilling way? And having that control actually matters because it basically at least assures you that you are living life a little bit more on your own terms. And so on the one hand, and then there may be actual things like I think that age group is also generally taking care of elderly parents and having to attend to things like that. So I'm sure it's different for each person within that generation. But I do think that this existential crisis may be a slightly less pressing need to always be in a social environment, and also taking care of elderly parents. Some of those things might have driven those changes. The one thing I link all of these findings to is the fact that we are seeing increasing amounts of burnout. And one of the key causes of burnout is lack of control. So when people are requesting flexibility, what they're saying is, I want more control because I don't want to be as burnt out by the pressure of having to do something.
Well, I think that's right. When we asked respondents to the survey what they thought might go a very long way toward helping their mental health, 70% of them said it's flexibility. So I think there's something to that. And I want to peel out something though. Significantly more women are working completely remotely than are men. Men are more likely to have a hybrid working schedule or completely on site. Now, I recognize fully that sometimes your company will direct you and tell you exactly what kind of schedule you'd like to have, and that may drive your decision to become part of the Great Resignation. But nevertheless, I wonder if this is correlated and maybe would help a little bit because more women than men indicated a deterioration of mental health since the onset of the pandemic. Is there something connected there that that drive? I mean, I'm sure childcare and elder care, is a factor here, but I'm wondering if there's something that can be helpful in giving women the opportunity to have more control, to be more remote, perhaps, and that might help with mental health. I don't know. How do you see it?
Well, from a number of different perspectives. So I think from a mental health perspective, what we know is that at baseline, women and men have higher prevalences of different mental health syndrome. So for women, anxiety and depression, they have much greater anxiety and depression. For men, there are much higher rates of substance abuse and antisocial personality disorder. But when it comes to the work situation, anxiety and depression can really show up first. And so I think if you have a higher baseline rate of anxiety and depression, and then you have stresses at work, that's probably going to exacerbate that. So that would be the first reason I think I would think. The second is that there was a survey that was done in 2020 by McKinsey on women in the workplace. And what they did find was that women tended to really shoulder a lot of the burden of many of the changes that were occurring and were often occupying positions where they had burdens coming at them from a whole lot of different directions. And so I think part of this has to do with the positions that women occupy in the workplace. Although we've certainly had some improvement in how women are working in the workplace, I think between January 2015 and December 2019, the number of women in senior vice president positions increased from 23 to 28%, and in the C-suite from 17 to 21%. But that's still not a very high number of people in those positions. So one of the things it makes me wonder about is what positions are women occupying in organizations that are creating particular stresses that are making it much more difficult to live this kind of hybrid life. But there's also a notion of if more women are remote, then is this socially isolating in some way? And certainly there's the potential for threat to this advancement, depending on the organization. So I think for organizations that are focused on promotion based on KPIs or leadership skills, that wouldn't apply. But there are some organizations where promotion is highly dependent on social capital. And social capital means hanging out with people in the same environment and people getting to see you and getting to feel connected to you. So the decision for promotion might be more emotional. I think those thoughts are all related to the fact that, firstly, why do women have more of these mental health concerns? Probably because they're shouldering a lot more of the burden, and probably because of the positions they're occupying within organizations. Secondly, are women at risk by being in this position? They might be if the mechanism for promotion is social capital. So I think organizations should probably, women should be aware of what the criteria for promotion are, so that they don't keep being stalled in this movement toward higher level positions within organizations.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there are many of us who are very concerned that the progress that women and people of color in particular have made in the last 20 years stands a good chance of being eroded, if not erased, simply because, it's difficult sometimes to be front and center in someone's mind. And a remote worker of any type, I think, is very sensitive to being thought of, not last, and being thought of as part of a larger developmental process or for leadership or promotion opportunities. So that is a concern, I think, particularly because so much energy has been put into bringing people along. I think organizations are going to have to redouble their efforts to think about what does excellence and performance and leadership look like in this new sort of probably hybrid world for a while at least, and how can we make sure that people are seen, are heard, are given those opportunities, and can continue their own career growth. We know career advancement is a driver, has been traditionally for a very long time for people who seek another opportunity. Let's not let organizations force that because an employee might feel that she just can't get an opportunity for advancement at that organization and will go somewhere else.
I was just going to say that I think there's also that statistic is tricky because it's true that 54% of women felt that their mental health was deteriorating, but that leaves 46% of women who did not feel that way. And so I think it's a catch-22 situation. On the one hand, we're focusing on women being vulnerable and being a vulnerable population because of the structure of work or because of baseline variables. But it does leave the question of, but women are also prone to being stereotyped as women and not being seen specifically as who they are or what their work is. And one of the questions that arises is, can women also learn from other women? What's happening with the other 46% of women whose mental health did not deteriorate? And if their mental health did not deteriorate, are they doing something different than the 54% of women who had greater challenges? So I don't think that it's the only variable that plays a role. That gender or sex is the only variable that plays a role. I think that it's one of the variables that plays a role. But if 46% of women did not report that, it suggests that there are probably other factors playing a role in that particular population.
Yeah, I mean, in some of the research we've done, there is a distinct difference in terms of someone's organizational positional power or lack thereof. And if the case is that most people in leadership positions are male and fewer are women, or women are disproportionately in the lower ranks of the organization, it tends to play into, just as you are talking about, in terms of how much power they have or how much control they have over their working lives. So now, we did ask survey respondents, what are the reasons to return to the workplace? And to your point earlier, I think a lot of it is social. I want to just call out that 1 in 6, 15% said there was no good reason to return to the physical workplace. I'm not sure that's right either. But I do think that organizations need to be thoughtful about, why are you bringing people back, right? What's the way in which you re-recruit your employees, and what are the ways in which you best use that time together? So when they told us what they wanted to return to the office for, the workplace, they said largely it was around connection. Connecting with team members. That was like 3/4 of the folks said that. Socializing and gathering with colleagues, brainstorming with teams, attending events and organizational activities, connecting with their manager. I mean, human beings are social creatures, and all of the top responses were really along those lines. So what happens, in our mental health when we become more isolated? How can organizations support workers who perhaps want to or choose to or can work remotely? How do you keep that kind of culture building going?
Well, as you said, I think it does depend on the organization and it depends on the team that you're working with. And the first thing I would say is that decisions are probably best made together with others. I think it would be good for organizations to have a good understanding of what people want. So the very first thing I would say is find out what your people want by asking them. Secondly, try to explore how what they want impacts productivity in an experimental way. You might even be able to say, let's try this out, and then let's try something else out, and let's compare those two things and see how this impacts you in terms of your productivity, but also in terms of your mental health. I think the the whole point about people wanting to come back to work because of social connections, I think speaks to the fact that social connections play a very important role in mental health. As you said, we are social creatures. In fact, when you look at how we're wired with some very interesting capabilities. I always half joke with when CEOs when I'm coaching them and they're asking me, "What do you think about this new hire? Do you think I should bring them on board?" I'll say, "Well, do you want them to live in your brain?" Because all people who are around us actually live in our actual neural tissue. Right? They actually live in our brains and they impact our brain. So if you have an angry person in your brain constantly, that's going to influence the rest of your body. Also, we know that social connections matter because when you are lonely, you might be more prone to depression, you might be more prone to anxiety, and loneliness can also impact the body. What we know from studies is that loneliness can decrease immunity, it can decrease cellular immunity so that you might become more prone to infections. Loneliness can also it's correlated with coronary calcification. And what this tells us is that the way you feel is really not just about what's going on mentally, but it impacts your body as well. And I think that in terms of people doing things in a more insightful way, the very first thing I would really ask managers to be aware of is that we call it mental health, but honestly, the brain doesn't stop functioning at the neck. People with depression have much higher rates of cardiac problems. Same thing with people with anxiety. The mind and the body are all connected. And so I think it behooves any leader to try to understand and be sensitive to the fact that something that's identified as a mental health problem could, in fact, impact that person's body. First thing. The second thing, to be able to learn a language to address this sensitively and privately. Thirdly, to make accommodations where this could be helpful. So, for example, if someone is back in the workplace and they're depressed, a lot of times having an extra amount of light may be helpful. If somebody is back in the workplace and needs to see a therapist once a week, being able to create that environment of flexibility can be very helpful. And then I think focusing the conversation on the work, and then connecting it, so rather than saying, I'm noticing you're very jittery, and so these things are not getting done. I think learning the language of saying, what can I do to help you operate at your best potential? Because so many people, when they're hired for their potential. But once they get into the workplace, this potential is somehow lost, and so they get critiqued for being who they are. And I think a lot of studies have shown, studies on emphasizing positive traits, that you get much more out of people. Firstly, if you're aligned in aspiration. So we know that research out of McKinsey has shown that when organizations are aligned in aspiration for like how, if everybody agrees that hybrid is better, that remote is better, that, I'm not saying you always have to have consensus, but I think if you can have alignment in aspiration, you're much more likely to gain strategic speed. But also, if people understand that your caring is not just nominal, you're not just saying, oh, we've got mental health benefits, and yeah, you can use that benefit, or you can go to EAP, but you're actually building into your culture a language of sensitivity that doesn't let go of the importance of work and goals, but that also acknowledges the humanity of the person. I think that's how you start to build a strong culture. And I think that's what the leaders of tomorrow are really going to be about. Jacob Morgan in his study showed that the future is really about humanizing and futurizing. And humanizing is a big part of, I think, what you're touching on.
I think you're spot on. I mean, respondents told us that they felt that their managers, in the main, were supportive, that they were empathetic, that they had tried to, when they became aware of a mental health issue, that they tried to adjust the workload or make team adjustments. And yet, about 1 in 5 said that they did not feel that way about their manager. So hopefully, those managers will listen to this podcast and hear what you've just said, which are the things that they need to do. But when we asked them what do they want, so a couple of things came up. One, they wanted programs on how to thrive and flourish, as opposed to just being resilient. Because I think if you have to kind of, pick yourself up by the bootstraps for the 17th time in about that many months, it gets wearing. And so we asked them about that. And so they want those kinds of training. They wanted mental health apps, for meditation and stress reduction. And they also wanted virtual reality platforms. And the surprise to me was that all generations wanted virtual reality platforms to the same degree. Now, I know I'm talking to a man who just co-founded a virtual therapeutic platform to address mental health issues. I'm wondering if you could, first of all, tell me if that's sort of what you find in the work that you do with organizations, and then what are some of the positive outcomes that you're finding?
Yes. So, firstly, in terms of organizations, I find broadly speaking, organizations are hiring me or asking me to work with them for two reasons. Some people are still in the how do we bounce back and how do we recover mode, whereas other people are in the, recovery is recovery, but we want to thrive because it doesn't seem like this adversity is going to be going anywhere anytime soon. So, how do we thrive in adversity? And when I teach programs on thriving in adversity, I focus on a concept called anti-fragility, which was a term that was coined by Nassim Taleb, which is about people who can thrive in adversity. Meaning, some people really get thrown off by adversity, whereas other people say, there's an opportunity here, and I'm going to use the momentum and the confusion and the chaos to my advantage. And so, one big concept for me here is possibility thinking, to change from simply saying what is and realize that you can be the architect of your own future. And being the architect of your own future is a very different set of skills than recovering from the current reality. So people who are just interested in resilience are just responding to the current reality. People who are interested in thriving are architecting a different reality from their own imaginations. And these mindset strategies, I think, are very important to be able to incorporate as you're trying to build a different culture. Where we apply virtual reality, we are finding, well, firstly, the studies show, and this might be surprising because you'd imagine that just younger people can adopt virtual reality, but studies show that older generations can adopt it just as well. So I think your finding is consistent with what the studies currently show. I think the second piece is that virtual reality can be used, so Reulay, the company I co-founded, where I'm the chief medical officer, is interested in helping to reduce stress and anxiety using a virtual reality platform. And the reason is that virtual reality offers some very specific things that talking programs or two-dimensional imagery or apps do not offer. The very first thing is that virtual reality offers you a sense of embodiment. So you're not just learning from looking or from using your mind to think about something. Your body is actually registering a new intelligence. When you take those 10 minutes to give yourself a break from a day that's going downhill, it's actually changing your body, which then communicates with your mind, and your mind starts to feel more relaxed. So what we've got is a number of different paradigms. We have 6 different experiences that last 10 minutes each that people can use at least once a day. We've done studies, some preliminary studies in this, that show that this technique can actually decrease anxiety, nervousness, jitteriness, emotional distress, and can also help improve focus. So we're encouraged that what we know theoretically about virtual reality, which is that it can improve memory and it can create what we call embodied learning, is actually showing up in the way in which people feel within organizations. While I don't think that virtual reality is the only tool, I think the world is moving in the direction of exploring what embodied learning means. And embodied learning, for me, is about just adding another set of tools that may be helpful to people. With Reulay, we're actually also offering a capability for a machine learning platform because, as I said earlier, I don't think one size fits all. But if we can learn who responds to these apps versus who responds to Reulay versus who responds to a cognitive intervention, now we're beginning to actually treat people as the individuals that they are, and not just lumping everybody into one big basket.
Well, I think it's fascinating because what we have learned is that just the same way, we're looking at generational cohorts or looking at it by gender, everyone's different and they're going to learn differently, they're going to cope differently, they're going to get better differently. And so that's, I think, where organizations need to begin to think. An EAP program serves many good functions. It's not sufficient. At least that's what they're telling us from these surveys. It's not in and of itself sufficient. So we need an array of tools that we think will have a positive impact. One last thing before our time is up, I just wanted to mention a couple of things that workers told us their organizations could do that they would appreciate, and it goes back to your point, Srini, about having control, setting boundaries, feeling as though you are indeed driving the bus here. So what they told us, the top 2 things they told us, 2/3 said that they wanted an organization that encourages employees to disconnect at the end of normal working hours. And we've all seen the headlines about Portugal, and it's going to be illegal now to expect workers to respond to emails after that. But I think there's probably something to that. That we'll see some variation on that theme here. They wanted the ability to take a no work vacation day without feeling guilty, that they weren't letting their teammates down if they truly did unplug. Scheduling blocks of time, having organizational off limit times that were blocked out for meetings. But I think a lot of it was really about having consistent rules around the organization and what the expectations were for workers. And to your point earlier, ask them how they'd like to work. We know that productivity remained as high, if not higher, during the pandemic. And I think you and I would be the first to say that comes at a cost. But we can show that we can be productive in a remote setting if we can maybe package this in ways that support workers on many levels. Well, Srini, I want to thank you for joining me. And I want to give you the last word. If you had one piece of advice for leaders, we've seen what the survey results are, what workers have said to us. If you had one piece of advice for leaders as to how they could best support their workers, what would you share with them?
I think I would say that providing an array of tools that you can provide to a diverse audience is probably the way to go when you're trying to appreciate the mental health of people. But I would say most important is the ability to give people a voice so that they feel empowered to be able to be part of the team that you're trying to create. We know that strategic speed depends on three factors from Justin Davis's research: clarity, unity, and agility. And I think if we communicate clearly, if we are aligned in aspirations, which is the unity, and if we allow people the flexibility that gives them that agility, we can really harness those three factors to be able to create organizations that are working at speed.
Well, terrific. I want to thank you again, Srini, for joining me. And I want to thank all of you who have spent some time listening to these thoughts. Would encourage you to engage with the entire series of podcasts that we have available on Apple and Google and iHeart Radio and wherever you get your podcasts. And I want to thank my guest, Dr. Srini Pillay, co-founder and chief medical officer at Reulay. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.